Colonel Douglas MacGregor, it's always a reassurance to me, actually, just to be with you, just to hear your thoughts. So thank you once again for making time for me.
Oh, my pleasure, Neil.
Obviously, given recent events, I have to ask you for your insights on Syria. I suppose, first of all, did anyone see this coming? And so quickly, after a war that kicked off, well, all the way back in 2011 at least?
Well, I think that's right. I think we have to keep in mind that since 2011, since Obama signed the order for the overthrow of the regime in Damascus, the CIA, MI6, Mossad have all been working to promote the overthrow of the government and overthrow and the removal of Assad. They've done many, many things, but probably the most important thing is that they forged this temporary alliance, and I say temporary because I don't think it's a permanent feature of the terrain, but a temporary alliance between the Turks and the Israelis, so that we're looking at a region that's now, at least in the foreseeable future, is going to be dominated by those two states. And the various Islamist fighters who were graduates of Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, ISIS, and so forth, were effectively rebranded as rebels trying to defeat the evil Assad. They were well trained and equipped, coached, organized by us, but I think primarily by the Turks. And the Turks are the ones that they're listening to, that is Mr. Erdogan and his intelligence officers. We've now seen Turkish forces move a little further south, below the territory they've already occupied in Syria. I think we'll see a larger Turkish footprint in Syria now. And the Israelis have moved up to a line that is just short of Damascus. And I hear that the Israelis are very enthusiastic about the prospect of making Damascus part of the greater Israel project. We'll have to see whether or not that occurs.
Is that a circumstance that Erdogan, as you say, he often seems to style himself as the leader of the Islamic world, or would he be able to swallow that down, presiding over a Turkey that looks on at Damascus, another of the Holy of Holies, world's oldest capital, being in Israel's hands?
Well, we'll see. It's a great great Islamic city, as you say, one of the leading cities of the Islamic world in terms of learning centers. It's a beautiful place. I don't know that the Turks will be enthusiastic about that. I would say that this is similar to what happened in 1939 between the Soviets and Germany. You had a partition of Poland then. We had partitions of Poland in the 1790s between the Prussians, Russians, and Austrians. I think what we're seeing right now is something similar with the Israelis and the Turks and their Islamist allies. And Guderian, who participated in this, a very famous German general, he met his Soviet counterpart at the so-called demarcation line, and he confided to his diary and later spoke to Hitler about it and said, I have an uneasy feeling because we've just moved the border of the Soviet Union 300 miles further to the west, sacrificing all of this territory. He wasn't very, very comfortable with it. Well, I think right now there are probably many senior Israeli officers that are looking at this as, yes, this is a victory. Yes, this is a good thing. Assad may be gone, but what is replacing him may be even worse. And secondly, can we really assimilate all of this territory and the people that are in it easily? Have we overreached? And do we really want what effectively is a border between Israel and Turkey somewhere in Syria? I'm sure the Israelis are thinking about these things. I know they are. But for the moment, this is a great victory. They want to celebrate it. And I think this is a critical step on the road to the Israeli attack on Iran, which presumably will include us.
How are we to interpret the reaction, or almost the absence of a reaction, really, from Russia, from China, from Iran? After all these years, this seeming shrugging of shoulders as though in the face of something inevitable. How should we interpret that?
I don't think it's a question of shrugging it off. Remember that these are peoples that have been around for thousands of years. The Turks and the Iranians have fought many, many wars. So have the Turks and the Russians. So they know each other. I think what has happened is that both President Putin and his government, as well as the leadership in Iran, were surprised at the rapidity and speed with which Mr. Erdogan betrayed them, because they'd had agreements reached. I don't know the content of all of them, but they did have an agreement on Syria designed to sort of pacify the area, to allow for some sort of reconstruction. And they created zones of interest. One of those zones, of course, was around Idlib, and that was the concentrated area of Islamist fighters that Mr. Erdogan protected from Russian destruction. The Russians wanted to go in there and annihilate them. And of course, we were at the time, favorably disposed to that, but Erdogan didn't want it. And then we had another enclave further to the southwest, about 11,000 of them that we trained, organized, equipped, and set up. Bottom line is that this whole thing was agreed in Sochi and Astana, and it suddenly came unglued almost overnight, and largely because the United States, Israel, Turkey, and of course the intelligence services working together decided this was the time to strike. And remember, Syria has always been a forward position for the Iranians that they could employ to deter the Israelis. Well, now the Israelis have turned the tables on them. The real problem, though, for both sides is that the Kurds have a de facto independent state within Syria, and that's unacceptable to the Turks. So I think the Turks are looking at the Kurdish problem, and they may want to turn their guns on the on the Kurds, long before they do turn the guns on the Israelis. The Israelis, on the other hand, are happy to have this forward position and see people on their periphery engaged in conflict with each other so that they can focus on Iran. Now, Russia is standing back and watching this. Russia had a very small presence, had a warm water port, of course. They liked that, but it was not vitally strategic to them. In other words, it's nothing that they can't live without, particularly because I think we will find others in North Africa who will be receptive to a Russian naval presence and potentially a Russian air base. And that was all that they were interested in, was a simple base. Now, we have 840 bases around the world. Russia only had one in the Mediterranean. I think we need to keep that in mind. But for them, it wasn't a vital strategic necessity to retain it. But I think now what Mr. Erdogan has to deal with, and I think also Mr. Netanyahu, is the fact that Putin in particular, as president of Russia, has tried to work with both of them closely. And now he's been fundamentally betrayed by both Israel and Turkey. And the Russians do not forget those things. This is right now an unredeemed, unearned defeat strategically for Russia. And now I think the Israelis are going to turn on Iran. And when they do, they're going to find Russia standing next to Iran.
I'll come to Iran, but as you say, Turkey betrayed Russia, simply. Does that say something about Russia, in the context of Ukraine, where Russia seems so strong, has seemed on the point of outright victory there? Does Turkey assessing this as a time to betray Russia say something about a hitherto unsuspected fatigue or any kind of a weakness about Russia?
It's hard to say. I don't think I would regard it as a weakness. I'm sure that President Putin in private circles in his government is embarrassed. After all, Putin was instrumental in alerting Mr. Erdogan to a coup that was staged to remove him. And Russian intelligence actually came to his assistance. And has a number of commercial arrangements with the Turks that are very favorable to Turkey, one of which is to build a nuclear power station in Turkey. And obviously, the Russians, who, as I said before, had at least 100 wars over 300 years with the Turks, isn't interested in going to war with the Turks. I don't think the Turks are interested in going to war with Russia. But Russia, nevertheless, feels betrayed by this action. And I think it's fundamentally shifted the attitude in Moscow against Turkey. So the Turks simply are not going to be able to turn to Moscow for very much. When you mention Ukraine, there are several hundred Ukrainian soldiers or officers working with these Islamist terrorists, flying drones for them in close air support. We also have sent out aircraft to fly some close air support missions for these Islamist fighters. And then, of course, you had this enormous air campaign of 120 aircraft striking targets all over Syria to eliminate any residual military presence that the previous regime may have had. So it's a very strange environment. These Israelis are working hand in glove with the Turks. We are happy about it, but I think we're going to end up with some degree of what the Germans call Schadenfreude. In other words, I don't think we're going to be terribly happy down the line either. But we don't control events on the ground anymore. They're out of our control. They're in the hands of the Turks primarily, and secondarily the Israelis.
And if that's the case in relation to Russia, then what about China? You know, all of the massive effort that's been undertaken by China over recent years, the Belt and Road, I mean, and then the Silk Road itself, which would seem to be severed by what's just happened. Does China just walk away from all of that investment and soft diplomacy and take another path?
Well, I would not write off the road that is being built between Iran's Indian Ocean coast all the way through the Caucasus to Russia. Wouldn't write that off at this point. Clearly, Mr. Erdogan would like to divert everything through him and his satellites. And the Israelis, of course, have been receiving oil as a result of Mr. Erdogan's influence, as well as ours, through the Kurdish territory, where we have 900 soldiers controlling the oil wells as well as some agricultural area in Syria. That starved Assad's government of cash. So he had no real income coming from those areas with which he was formerly dependent upon. And of course, that hurt. But we're in a difficult position now, because when Mr. Erdogan inevitably turns against the Kurds, are we going to go to war with the Turks over Kurdistan and over the Kurds? I think not. I rather doubt that. But that's going to unfold at its own pace and time. And I don't know how rapidly that will happen, but I know that right now, Israel is looking at the situation as probably ideal from their security standpoint, insofar as attacking Iran is concerned. Iran is on the back foot. Iran also has to keep its eye on Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is another Turkish state. In fact, Azerbaijan and Turkey refer to themselves as two states in one nation. The Armenians are once again under threat, but more important, Azerbaijan is a platform for attack against Iran that's utilized by Israel. So it's a very messy situation, but the Israelis are beginning to conclude the iron is hot. They're riding high in the saddle, as we say. They have the United States that is obedient to their orders. And so I think they're going to attack Iran sooner rather than later.